Have any of you ever had a game that helped you through a tough time? It doesn't have to be a particularly bad time. Maybe it only seemed tough at the time, and upon reflection wasn't that big of a deal at all. The point is, has a game ever allowed you to forget and unwind while the rest of life was otherwise vying hard for your complete and constant attention? I can only think of one example of this as far as the long term goes. Sure, everyone has a bad day and needs a Katamari or something to help them swap moods or whatever, but there's only one time I can remember where a game kept me away from worries that extended beyond just a day. That game was Need for Speed Underground 2. At the time, this was my first Need for Speed in a long while. I'd played a bit of Underground 1 once, and I owned Need for Speed High Stakes on the PS1 as well as Need for Speed 2 on the PC, but I hadn't played any of them for years other than that tiny bit of Underground 1. Then I saw that there was a demo for Underground 2 on Burnout 3, and I absolutely fell in love when I played it. I played the demo almost as much as I played Burnout 3 itself, and I played that game a ton. Not long after, a friend of mine allowed me to borrow Underground 2, and I immersed myself in all of the new concepts it offered. That weekend was nothing but Underground 2. Literally, I don't remember anything but the game, and what it allowed me to forget for those few days. I enjoyed the game so much that I've closely followed Need for Speed since. While I haven't played every game since Underground 2, I've played a fair chunk of them, including the preceding and succeeding titles. Underground 1, which I take a lot of issue with, and Most Wanted, which is fundamentally flawed, but I still really enjoy it. I would like to say something to the effect of, I wonder if this game holds up, and this is my chance to find out. But honestly, I've played through this game several times since the first time, and I already know the answer to that. So because of that, and my personal connection with the game itself, though this won't be as grand as one of my more major reviews, I'm going to review it in a more fluid manner. No categories, just information and review. I want to exhaust my thoughts on this game as much as time will allow. Let's get the junk out of the way first. Need for Speed Underground 2 was released on November 9th, 2004, on pretty much every platform to exist at that point. I didn't play it until around late 2005, almost a year later. The version we are looking at here is for the PS2, which is considered the middle ground between the better Xbox version and the worst GameCube version. The story is, well, it's about as relevant as the story to Super Mario Bros. Is. You seem to play as the same person from Underground 1, as evidenced by the Nissan Skyline he's driving, and the fact that he starts out in Olympic City. I didn't really get that from the opening cutscene, but no matter. Some menacing figure asks you to join his racing crew. When you presumably blow him off, he sends a massive Hummer to teach you a lesson. One accident later, and the game flashes forward. You're now in Bayview, and you're given a second chance by a woman named Rachel. Effectively, your goal is to dominate Bayview's racing scene, as well as to take down the crew who did you wrong, led by a man named Caleb. As already stated, this story doesn't matter at all. There's a ton of information on the wiki about how Caleb is manipulating sponsor deals and such, but unless you read every bit of text the game has to offer, most of which is just pre-race fluff, the vast majority of this won't come across to you at all. You'll understand that someone is out for your blood and winning races will help you reach your own goals, and that's about all you need to know. Underground 2 is presented to the player as an open world, where the player needs to drive to various locations where people are meeting up to race. But as Rachel tells you, in Bayview, winning isn't enough. What matters is by how much you win. The better you do, the more reputation you earn. That's what she tells you. But pull back the curtain and you'll quickly see the systems at play, and realize the fact that rep actually only gains you the chance to get your car on magazine covers, which are optional. Now, these magazine cover events are unique, in that they're point-to-point time trials where you get to choose which route you take. Basically, the person who wants to take pictures of your magazine has to leave somewhere really quickly, so you have to drive to his location as fast as possible to get the pictures taken. And when you succeed, you get to see your car on the cover of presumably mostly real magazines, as well as you get some cash based on how high your car's style rating is. Speaking of events, there are several other kinds strewn across the world. You have your obvious ones like Circuit and Sprint. Drift is back from Underground 1 as well. So are drag races. The two new types of races are street cross races. No, it's not Street X. and URL Races, which stands for Underground Racing League. Street Cross is the same as an autocross race, but it's on the streets, yo! These are short, super tight technical courses. Managing speed through corners and hitting the apexes is key here. They're over before you know it, so make sure to put distance between you and your opponents while you can. URL races, meanwhile, are kind of officially sanctioned races that your sponsors ask you to race in. Sometimes they're a single race, and other times they're a series of up to 3 races, I believe. Other than that, the only difference between them and a normal circuit race is the location. It is a silly concept though when you think about it. Somehow, you're getting real-life companies like Yokohama and Brembo to sponsor you in illegal street races. These sponsors then officially sanction races that take place on live airport landing strips and closed racetracks, which is illegal. It's an absolutely ridiculous idea, but if these real-life sponsors are okay with their names being used in such context in a game, I see nothing wrong with it. It's hilarious to me. For a quick refresher, in case anyone hasn't played these games, drift races ask the player to gain as many points as they can, drifting through a course. Higher angles and speeds will get you more points. Getting close to the walls will practically double the points you're getting, and reaching point milestones will give you a point multiplier. There are track-based drift events, which are more controlled and have you directly racing competition. The other type of drift event is a downhill sprint. Everyone does the event separately, drifting from point A to point B. You will have to watch out for traffic in these events, but drifting close to civilian cars also gets you more points. Drag races change a few things from normal races in an attempt to offer a unique gameplay style. In drag events, you're required to use the manual transmission. Shift points are important, so a large focus should be on shifting at the right time. This can make all the difference, and if you let the engine rev too high for too long, you can blow your motor. Crashing totals the car. You don't actually lose your car or anything, but you have to retry the event. These events remove the ability to directly control your car's left to right movement. Instead, each drag strip has a series of lanes that you can tap left or right to move between and avoid obstacles. All of these different event types offer a rather large amount of variety, but there's actually even one more type of event that's only possible because of Underground 2's open world. Outrun races can be started anytime you roll up on another racer in the world. These races ask you to put a certain amount of distance between you and your opponent to win. Whoever is in the lead controls the path that needs to be taken. Winning can net you money, as well as extra car parts if you win enough. I'll touch more on Outrun races a little later. The other major aspect of this game is car modification. There are tons and tons of parts for your cars, as well as 29 cars to choose from. These parts can be performance parts or aesthetic ones of varying kinds, from bumpers and side skirts to lights, hydraulics, spinners, vinyls, neons, new gauges, wide body kits, trunk modifications, and much more. This was honestly my favorite part of the game back in the day because it was new and original. And while I still really enjoy it, a lot of these parts really don't hold up anymore. They look more like Hot Wheels car parts than something logical and realistic in a lot of cases. Still, it's an amazing part of the game that has only successfully been replicated by a few games since then, despite nearly every racing game trying. Underground 2 is essentially broken into 5 sections of world, as well as 5 stages. Each stage unlocks a new part of the world, and asks you to complete more races than you did before. These stages are stylistically separated into sponsors. Each stage has you getting sponsorship offers that you can choose from, all of which give you slightly different choices for how you get paid and what types of sponsor-requested races you need to do. These aren't really anything to worry about though, since there are only ever 3 sponsor-requested races in each stage besides the URL races, which are always the same. And the amount of money you receive across the stage is more or less the same regardless of your choice. It really is just an aesthetic choice based on which sponsors you like, really. Yeah, not a big deal. The point is, you're only let out of this contract with the sponsor once you do all of the requested races. Then you do one more race to get the eye of other sponsors, and start the process all over again. Being on the PS2, the expected controls can feel a bit outdated. Using face buttons, even if they're pressure sensitive, doesn't really work well anymore for accelerating and braking. Luckily, there are some smart controller options on offer here. Accelerating and braking can also be done using the right stick, therefore, shift down and up are L2 and R2 respectively. But there was even more care put into the controls than that. There are some subtle but smart decisions implemented into where the controls are placed. For example, since shifting up is R2, which you usually do while accelerating, nitrous is on L1, which is also usually done while accelerating. This means you can still shift up while using NOS while accelerating. Meanwhile, the e-brake is R1, which is usually used for slowing down, meaning you can still shift down while decelerating and using the e-brake. This means nothing you need at any given moment is ever in an awkward or unreachable position. Well, except for the ability to look behind you. Unless you're in the hood cam, which has a rear view mirror simulated at the top, you have to hit the triangle button to look behind you, which requires letting off the gas and the brake entirely. But honestly, it's not too big of a deal. If you play modern racing games, these controls still take some getting used to. More than once did I shift down or up while trying to accelerate or decelerate. But you should adjust quickly enough. It's a great compromise overall, and it felt totally natural in just a few hours. It's particularly smart because the game has pressure sensitivity for accelerating and decelerating, meaning the right stick provides a lot of needed nuance. On the PS2, you can still get this nuance from the face buttons, but again, it's a lot harder to be delicate on these face buttons because of the short travel. There is no damage modeling in Underground 2, meaning you don't have to worry about being a sloppy mess on the track. Early reviews claimed this lack of damage was a negative. In reality, it's fine, and those reviewers can go suck an egg. I personally always find it extremely annoying when a game has visual damage modeling, but doesn't have simulated mechanical damage modeling as well. This game wouldn't do well to have mechanical damage enabled. You'll hit thousands of walls over the career mode, and mechanical damage would completely ruin the game. So why visually show generic paint chips and window crack damage by slapping terrible textures on the model if the cars aren't actually taking damage? Half of what this game is about is making a beautiful masterpiece of a car. Why would you want that to get torn up? The AI would destroy you if there was damage modeling anyway. Speaking of, the AI is pretty good in this game. It's rather sophisticated for its time. Rubber banding in most event types is not really aggressive. The AI also makes mistakes. They don't always take the best lines, and they're not afraid to trade paint. If you want, they can provide a real challenge, and if you don't, they won't. I tried all of the difficulties for this review, and they fit their descriptions well. Easy is both easy to get first in, and to get max rep in. If you just like driving tracks fast and trying to beat your own times, this mode is for you. Medium is still not too difficult to get first in, but the races are a lot closer. Major mistakes can cost you the race. Plus, that means getting max rep is a real challenge on medium. Hard, meanwhile, is difficult on all fronts. Unfortunately, sometimes certain race types like drag events feel unwinnable on hard. Along with trying the difficulties out, I also played the game with stability control on and off. I only played with stability control on for a few races near the end, but it gave me a good grasp of what it offers. This setting prevents oversteer without creating massive understeer. It's very usable and doesn't gut your vehicle of power like real stability control can. But for a skilled player, it still takes too much control away to be useful. Great for less skilled players, not needed and potentially detrimental for experts. If you're still having trouble, you might also try the new edition of detailed car tuning. Surprisingly enough, tuning makes a genuine difference, and is structured very much like tuning you'd find in a sim racer. You can alter everything from boost to sway bars, spring rates, ride height, gear ratio, aerodynamics, etc. And you can tune separately for each race type as well. You can really feel the care they put into making each car unique, both in how they drive, how tuning affects them, and how they sound. Compare the sound of this 240SX stock to this fully upgraded one. In fact, all of the sounds still hold up, from the car exhaust notes to crashes to the cheesy voice acting and even the soundtrack. Surprisingly, while the music does sound like it's from its time, Underground 2's soundtrack is full of music that still fits the game really well, and doesn't come off as embarrassingly cheesy, at least for me. Graphically, the game also still does well. Granted, on the PS2 you're stuck with 480i, meaning the image has a lot of aliasing and there's some minor combing you need to contend with, but the aesthetic design is spot on. The city of Bayview is perpetually stuck at night, which affords the designers a lot of variation in lighting and coloration. It has a consistent style that's loud and brash, but it really works well and still offers some variation. Go down into the Cole Harbor area and things feel more industrial, or head up into Beacon Hills and things feel darker and more isolated. The frame rate isn't perfect all the time, but it's more than playable. In fact, performance as a whole is pretty decent. Loading is somewhat frequent since the game needs to load so many different instances whenever you enter shops or enter races, but as long as you're just driving around, the world is seamless, no loading in sight, and regardless, the loading times are really short. I did have a few strange anomalous issues like this one. Which happened to me twice, but they weren't at all a big deal. Unfortunately, there is one major issue with aesthetics that doesn't hamper game performance, but does get in the way of the player's performance. Along with always being night, there are two forms of weather, raining and not raining. Rain seems to happen every dang race at one point or another. It kinda sucks because the game gets really muggy when it's raining, but it's rather crisp and beautiful when it's not. But it also makes it difficult to see. Sure, rain changes the physics slightly, which is entertaining, but I don't like it visually. Everything gets covered in a thick haze of color and water droplets. It makes the world look a lot more samey and almost looks like a camera lens smudge when you're traveling quickly. It really makes it difficult to get a handle on where you're going. It doesn't even get close to breaking the experience, but the fact that it's a problem that interferes with gameplay at all isn't really okay. Maybe that's the point, but it puts too much of a damper on the aesthetics and the gameplay if you ask me. It should have been dialed back. Again, this isn't a sim racer, so I shouldn't be overly contending with the visual effects of weather, particularly when it happens on practically every dang race. So back to the open world and the racing for a second. While driving around, you can find hidden cache, tutorials, shops, and races, which all afford rewards for exploration. This complements the open world well, and exploring the world allows you to learn it really well, making you better in the races themselves, because they all take part on these very roads. The races are small in terms of amount of competitors, but there's an absolute ton of races overall. For me, it's too many. While the length of a race is never too long, the length of the game is far too long. Let's put this into perspective. My Final Fantasy IX review last year had me completing everything the game had to offer other than maxing out the characters and getting every card for the card game. Beating just the story took me around 35 hours if I recall. Killer 7 took me around 25, and Resident Evil 4 took me like 18 or something, with Far Cry 3 taking around 20. Underground 2 took me almost 27 hours to finish. Not to complete, but just to get through the final story race. I still had around 60 races to complete to 100% the game, which would have been another 10 hours or so of time. And if I tried to get max reputation on each race as well, I'd literally be playing this game forever. Again, That sort of thing works for simulation racers, because a long career mode is the expectation. You want to race as much as possible, because there's usually hundreds of cars and tons of things that you want to do. But for a game like this, for me personally, it just felt way too long. 10 to 12 hours is more than enough. Combine this with the fact that you're essentially doing the same thing across all 5 stages, and that you've unlocked basically everything by the start of the final stage, and it means progression basically stops around 7 hours before the end. Overall, the game can really drag because of the length. It starts to feel more like a list of chores. Other factors impact this feeling as well. The game is really designed for you to just stick with 1 or 2 cars. The garage itself in story mode is limited to just 5 cars, and there's no way you'll get the money to fully upgrade more than maybe 3 cars at maximum, particularly if you're constantly changing your visual style for fun. This is fine in a vacuum, but because of the length, it only adds to the feeling of a lack of progression, because you're not constantly moving from one thing to another in terms of vehicles you're using. Speaking of, it kinda sucks that you have to install a lot of crap on your car to meet style requirements. To progress in a stage, your sponsors also want you to get your car to a certain visual level, which earns you spots on DVD covers. This means you sometimes have to add parts to your car that you don't want to, just so it meets the requirements of the DVD cover. So I usually create a style slave car that's for nothing but magazine and DVD covers and such during the later game. Luckily, I didn't have to deal with that too much this time. And besides, all of the parts you've previously bought go back to your garage when unequipped, meaning they can be reapplied later. So one can also simply swap to the crap like spinners and neons, do the DVD cover events you need to do or whatever, and then reapply your old parts. Still, it pains me to have to waste money putting things like terrible split hoods and spinners on my car, even if it is for only a few minutes. It wastes money I could be spending on upgrading other cars. Regardless, you can still make some absolutely beautiful cars, even though, as stated up top, many of the parts on offer are kind of ugly. Moving on, drifting used to be my absolute favorite part of this game, but now that I've drifted in a lot more sim racers, drifting here isn't that great without a lot of car modification. It still feels good in a lot of ways, but one thing kills it. It feels like you have traction control on at all times. Even with a rear-wheel drive car pushing 300 horsepower to the wheels, any sort of angle that gets you good points leads to you slowing down a ton. It makes mini drifts unsustainable that would otherwise logically be perfect. You end up doing more back and forth fishtailing than actual drifting. It doesn't feel good and it makes flow difficult. Drifting can be completely fixed by tuning the car, but that requires the correct parts and the right knowledge to do so. It does technically get a little better regardless as your car gets faster, but it's never great without doing some work on the car first. And that's a strange limitation for an arcade racer. This game is clearly designed to accommodate people who are casual racing fans and those who are technical gearheads. But the main demographic is definitely the casual fans. Otherwise, it'd do better to have more simulation-style physics, damage modeling, etc. So making drifting feel so bleh without tuning your car is strange, because those casual people probably won't know how to do that. That being said, it feels far better than Underground 1, so there's that. Back to Outrun Races though, they aren't very fun. As stated, it's basically a tug-of-war where the leader has to outrun the person following, and they get to choose the path. Because of how long the races last, though, they generally lead you away from your next destination. They don't offer much money, and they take entirely too long, regardless of which difficulty you're on. They also have some glitchy issues. Like, for example, sometimes when you pass your opponent, it won't count as you gaining the lead. Then they tend to turn around and start driving the other way, leaving you in the dust. But the player can't do the same thing to them. If you stopped and turned around, they would pass right by you and gain the lead every time. However, the biggest problem is that outrun races are required in order to unlock various unique visual upgrades, as well as performance upgrades. Plus, they're the only way to unlock wide body kits for the story, which are my favorite visual upgrade. I hate outrun races, really. Good idea, terrible execution. What I ended up having to do was hit the freeway and stomp my opponents there. They usually can't compete with raw speed, and using a pit maneuver on them right as the race starts doesn't hurt either. But the point is, this is a boring and cheap solution to a problem that shouldn't exist. These races are just too long and they're not fun. To put it into perspective, my average outrun race lasted no less than 7 to 10 minutes doing it the way the game asked, and I only won one of them. There was a point a few years back when I had an outrun race last 45 minutes. Once I did the freeway trick, they regularly lasted about 6 to 12 seconds, with the longest one being about 2 minutes. 2 minutes sounds about perfect, maybe 1.5. It's telling that there are several guides online detailing how to cheat these races in different ways, because they're just too difficult otherwise. I have a theory as to why. On the surface, it seems like rubber banding is on overdrive here, because these cars are so dang hard to lose, and they always seem to catch up extremely quickly. But I think it's deeper than that. I think it's actually a programming inconsistency, dealing with the object draw distance. I believe that the obstacles like civilian cars despawn too soon after you pass them. What this would mean is that once your opponent is far enough behind you, they don't actually have to dodge anything that you had to dodge. It already despawned. Meanwhile, while the rubber banding slows them down when they're ahead of you, I still think that no traffic is spawned up where they are, again meaning they have a clear road ahead, while you don't. Regardless, the balance of these races doesn't work, and I don't like it. Outrun races are a great way to flesh out the world when going place to place, in theory. They give the player something to do that's more freeform and within their direct control. They can start a race at any time, and as long as they're in the lead, they can drive wherever they want. But they just don't work in execution. I think the biggest issue with outrun races comes down to the risk versus the rewards. The difficulty of these races isn't justified by anything. From the very beginning, the payouts for the outrun races is small, but when you're spending this much time on a race, it doesn't feel justified. And if you lose, all of that time was wasted. At very least, the amount of time you spend versus the payout you get, on average, should be in line with other races. So if the average race takes 3 minutes in a stage, and the payout for it is $500 for first place, outrun races should keep consistent with that. If they are balanced to take 3 minutes, give the player $500. Another alternative that I think is superior, however, is raising the amount of money you win the longer the race takes, with modifiers for each stage of the game. Players shouldn't lose anything but time for losing the race, so that it doesn't become a barrier to continuing if they fail outrun races too many times. This would also offer players a way to gain more money in the post-game. But the important thing is that outrun races are actually useful, because the payouts just aren't enough, meaning why not just do other races instead that are easier and quicker. As we start closing in on the end of this review, there are a few more things that are worth mentioning. Unfortunately, the beginning and the end of this game are the best, with the large middle part being only pretty good. Cars are slow in the beginning for sure, but they feel at one with the road, and easy to control. You feel like you can be extra hard on them without worry. They feel raw and complete. By the end of the game, cars are a lot faster. Ironically, the great parts of describing the beginning of the game can actually also describe the end of the game. Cars feel like pure machines that can be thrown around at will, and are at one with the road. But the two ends of the game actually feel very different, besides the difference in speed, I mean. Early driving feels tame but technical, where the end feels wild and alive. You can throw the cars even harder in the late game, since the power and grip you have will undoubtedly get you back up to speed before you can even blink. But the early game is precise and sharp, with a focus more on small controller inputs at each moment. It's hard to describe, but while similar, they're both also really different and entertaining in their own ways. It's a shame then that most of the game is that awkward middle ground. Your car doesn't feel pure in its simplicity, nor in its perfection. It feels like a perversion of the base car, and like an awkward work in progress that hasn't reached the ultimate car that it can become. It's not bad by any means, but it's not what it could be. I think the issue is that mistakes still have huge penalties that they have in the early game, because your car just can't get up and go as fast as it usually does, nor turn quite as hard. but it doesn't offer the great rewards for taking huge risks like the late game does. Again, because you can't take the corners as hard, and you can't speed up as fast. It just sort of feels like a little bit of the worst of both worlds. Again, it's not terrible or anything, not even close, but it could have felt better. Also, once you finish the game, Outrun Races are your only option. You can't do anything else. And payouts for Outrun Races drop to $100 for some reason, meaning your career mode file is effectively dead. You can do all of the races you've already completed, as well as those you missed through the garage menu, but there's no payout for them, which is a strange decision. After spending almost 30 hours, it'd be great to be able to continue using my cars offline, since online modes are obviously no longer available. Overall, I still really like this game. I don't know if I'll ever play it all the way through again unless they release it in HD or something, hint hint. There's an enormous amount on offer here, and it still mostly holds up. Sure, some of the game aesthetics and mechanical choices are broken, but the game overall is a great time, mostly marred only by how long it lasts. But if that's what you're looking for, and you don't mind the, well, mindless repetition of doing literally hundreds of races with nothing really in between, or if you play the game in shorter stints, then you'll find a lot to love here. It's probably best to play the PC version though, because it probably runs on a toaster now, and definitely not the GameCube version. GameCube apparently has a lot more slowdown and other issues. So, how many of you have played Underground 2? Did you find it as captivating as so many others did? Also, do you have any games that you've completely immersed yourself in before? Comment below, and I'll see you guys next time. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you're interested in another one, here's the last one that I uploaded. You can also follow me on Twitter or subscribe by hitting the subscribe button.